Hello all and welcome back to the kitchen top for some more Pauper Commander. Today we have an extra special 4-player Pauper Commander game with Satyr, Enchanter, Rona, Cruel Celebrant and Enduring Scalelord. Chris, piloting Rona and going first, keeps a hand of Repeal, Weapon Rack, Mana Geode, Dreamstalker, Witch's Cottage, Halimar Depths and a Swamp. Carl is piloting Satyr Enchanter and has an opener with Naturalize, Conviction, Ghostly Possession, Crushing Canopy, Nyxborn Shieldmate, a Forest and a Plains. I am piloting Cruel Celebrant with an opening hand of Rootborn Defense, Grave Purge, Cabal Inquisitor, Bloodthrone Vampire, Scourge Barrens, a Swamp and a Plains. And finally Sam is playing Enduring Scalelord and keeps Traveller's Amulet, Llanowar Druid, Kajar Seed Sculptor, Arrest and 3 Forests. As a quick note, we filmed this video over a year ago, so we do not have the latest cards in our decks, obviously missing out some great inclusions from Commander Legends and other sets. We also don't have all 4 deck lists. But without any further ado, let's get to the game. Chris plays a Halimar Depths, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library. Carl plays a Forest, I play a tapped Scourge Barrens, gaining a life, and then Sam plays a Forest and taps it to cast a Traveller's Amulet. Chris plays his land for turn, then tapping for 1 black, plays a Wayfarer's Bauble. Carl follows up with a Plain, and then tapping that for 1 white, casts a Nyxborn Shieldmate. I follow up with the Plains of my own, then tapping a black and a white, I cast my commander. Sam plays a second Forest, and then casts an Implement of Ferocity. And then paying 1, he sacrifices his Traveller's Amulet to search for a Plains. Chris plays his Mystic Sanctuary tapped, and then activates Traveller's Amulet, searching for a Swamp. Carl taps 1 and a white to cast a Conviction on his Nyxborn Shieldmate. He then swings at Sam for 2 damage, putting him to 28. I play a Swamp and then going to attackers, swing my Cruel Celebrant at Chris for 1 damage. In my second main, I pay 1 white for a Soul Warden, and then tapping 2, I cast a Cabal Inquisitor, gaining 1 life off Soul Warden. Sam plays a Plains, and then tapping 3 casts Arrest on Carl's Shieldmate. Chris plays a Swamp for turn, and taps 3 to cast his commander. On her Enter the Battlefield trigger, he exiles Wayfarer's Bauble and then taps 1 to cast said Wayfarer's Bauble. Carl plays a land for turn and then wants to get in on the commander height, so casts Satyr Enchanter. I play a Plains and then tapping 2 cast Bloodthrone Vampire, gaining a life. I then send the team sideways and swing for 3 damage and 1 commander at Sam. Sam plays a Plains and then taps 2 for a Llanowar Druid. On Chris's turn, he taps 3 to cast a Mana Geode, scrying 1 when it enters, and then taps another 3 to cast an Aether Adept, bouncing Rona back to his hand. Carl taps 3 mana for an Oakenform on his commander, drawing a card. This gives Satyr Enchanter +3/+3. He then declares attacks at me. I block with my Bloodthrone Vampire, and then sacrifice my Soul Warden and Inquisitor, triggering my commander twice, and trading with Carl's Satyr, triggering my commander once more. In my turn I tap 4 mana to cast a Shattered Crypt, returning Soul Warden and Bloodthrone Vampire to my hand and losing 2 life. Sam plays a Forest for turn and then tapping all his lands, adds 5 mana to his mana pool. He then taps and sacks Llanowar Druid and retaps his 3 forests to add 3 more mana. He then plays his commander and Kajar Seed Sculptor, adding all the 1/1 counters. Chris pays 2 and sacrifices his Wayfarer's Bauble, searching for an island onto the battlefield. He then pays 3 for his commander, on ETB exiling Wayfarer's Bauble and paying 1 to cast it again, and he rounds out the turn swinging Aether Adept at me. Carl taps 1 green and casts a Vessel of Narcency, passing turn. I cast Innocent Blood, putting my commander in the graveyard, Sam sacks his Seed Sculptor, Chris puts Rona in the graveyard and Carl puts his commander in the command zone. Before that, Carl pays 1 white to bounce Conviction to his hand, and I drain and gain everyone for 1. I then pay 2 for a White of Precinct 6, which enters with 4 1/1 counters. And then I pay 1 white for a Soul Warden like the big dumb idiot I am. Paying 3, Sam casts Angelic Purge, sacrificing his implement and targeting my white, exiling it and drawing a card for himself. He then swings at me for 5 commander damage. Chris activates his Bauble again, getting another island. And then plays Witch's Cottage, putting Rona on top of his library. Carl pays 2 to activate his Vessel, revealing Nylea's Presence, Nissa's Pilgrimage, a Forest, and a Market Festival. He takes the Forest and puts the rest to the graveyard. He then plays the Forest and taps that and a Plains to cast Naturalize, targeting Mana Geode. Chris decides in response to tap it for a black, cycling Baron and more to draw his commander. I play a Swamp and tapping 2 cast Pacify. Sam readjusts it. Then paying 3 I cast Grave Purge, putting my commander back on top of my library and drawing it. Sam plays land for turn, then taps 5 mana for Lieutenants of the Guard. We all vote Strength, putting 4 1/1 counters on it, which then puts a 1/1 counter on his commander. Chris once again taps 3 mana to cast his commander, exiling Wayfarer's Bauble and recasting Wayfarer's Bauble. We lost some footage here, but Carl played a land in his commander, and I played a land and cast my commander and Bloodthrone Vampire. Sam plays a Plains and then adds 4 mana to his pool to cast Archbound Hybrid. It enters with 2 1/1 counters, which puts another counter on his commander, and I gain my Soul Warden life. He then swings his Lieutenant at me, I declare no blockers and go to 25. Chris once more activates his Wayfarer's Bauble and gets an island. He plays an island and then plays Dreamstalker. I gain 1 life off Soul Warden, and he bounces Rona back to his hand. He taps another 4 mana and casts a Weapons Rack, which enters with 3 1/1 counters, and then taps a further 2 for a Malevolent Noble. As it enters, I gain a life off Soul Warden. He then activates Weapons Rack, moving a 1/1 counter from it to Aether Adept, and he swings at me. I declare no blocks and go to 24. Carl taps 4 to cast Marked by Honor on his commander, drawing a card. He then plays another Plains, and then tapping that and the Forest, casts Conviction on his commander, drawing yet again another card. He then swings at me, and I declare Soul Warden as a blocker, which dies, triggering my commander. In my turn I cast Duress, targeting Chris. He reveals a Rona, Void Wielder, Deathwind, Whiplash Trap, and a Repeal, and I choose Repeal for him to discard. And I pass turn. Sam taps 3 and a green and casts a Corroster Monitor, and then taps a further 3 for Appetite for the Unnatural, targeting my pacifism. Give it to me. Thank you. He then swings his commander and the lieutenants at me. I block the lieutenants with my Bloodthrone Vampire, and cast Rootborn Defenses to give it indestructible, and I take 7 commander damage. Chris plays a Swamp, and then once again taps 3 for Rona, exiling Wayfarer's Bauble, and then taps 1 to cast Wayfarer's Bauble. He then activates Weapons Rack, moving a 1/1 counter to Aether Adept, and swings at me for 4 damage. Carl plays a Selesnya Guildgate for turn, and then tapping 4 mana, casts a Pierce Interdiction on Sam's commander, which gains him 2 life and draws a card. Carl plays a green for Vine Weft on his commander, and then swings at Sam, who chucks his Corroster Monitor under the bus. I cast a Chittering Rat, targeting Chris, and pass turn. Sam, tapping 3 mana, casts Map the Waste, putting a 1/1 counter on his Arcbound Hybrid, which puts a counter on his commander, and then searches his library for a forest onto the battlefield tapped. In Sam's end step, Chris does it again and gets an island tapped off Wayfarer's Bauble. In his turn, Chris moves the last counter from his Weapons Rack over to his Aether Adept, and then paying 2 he sacrifices the Weapons Rack to his Noble. He then taps a further 5 mana to cast Aven Surveyor, once again bouncing Rona to his hand. Speaking of once again, he swings Aether Adept at me, I block it with Chittering Rats, and when it dies, it triggers my commander. Carl plays a Forest, and then tapping 3, casts Harvest Guard Alcides, drawing a card. He then swings at Sam, dealing 6 commander damage. I draw and say go, and then Sam casts Whisperer of the Wilds. He declares attacks at Chris, who blocks the lieutenants with his Dreamstalker, and then paying 2, sacrifices the Dreamstalker to his Noble. And he takes 3 damage from the Hybrid. Chris plays a Swamp, and then recasts Rona, but this time exiles Weapons Rack. He taps the 4 to recast Weapons Rack, and I play Dice Supplier. He moves one of the counters to Aven Surveyor, and then swings it at Sam, who declares no blockers and takes 3 damage. Carl plays a Forest, and then tapping 2 mana, casts Force Worship on Chris's Aether Adept, drawing a card. He then taps a further 3 mana to cast Crushing Canopy, targeting Chris's Aven Surveyor. Holding priority, Chris uses 5 mana to cast a Whiplash Trap, targeting his bird and Carl's commander. In response to that, Carl activates his Conviction to bounce it to hand. Then the Whiplash Trap resolves. Carl then taps 3 to recast his commander. I draw a card, play a land, and say go. Sam plays Shoulders to Shoulder, putting a 1/1 counter on his Hybrid and his Lieutenants, which puts 2 1/1 counters on his commander, and then he draws a card. In his turn, Chris recasts his Aven Surveyor, bouncing Rona back to his hand, then taps Weapon Rack, moving one of the 1/1 counters to his Aven Surveyor. Carl plays a Plains and then taps it to cast a Tragic Poet, and then recasts Conviction on his commander, drawing another card. He taps a further white to cast Mortal Obstinacy on his commander, drawing a card, and then another green to cast Font of Vigor, drawing another card, and then a further green and a white to cast a Seal of Primordium, drawing another card. I tap 3 to cast a Mana Geode and scry a card to the bottom. Sam plays a Plains and then tapping it in another casts Center Soul, giving his lieutenants protection from white, and then declaring attacks at Carl, who takes 7 damage, going to 19. In his turn, Chris moves the final counter from Weapons Rack to his Aven Surveyor, and then sacrifices it to his Imposter, putting another counter on it. Chris recasts Rona, exiling Weapons Rack, then recasts Weapons Rack. He goes to move a 1/1 counter to his Aven Surveyor, but in response, Carl sacrifices his Seal of Primordium to blow it up. But in response to that, Chris sacrifices the Weapons Rack to his Noble. Moving to combat, he swings at Carl for 5 damage in the air. In Chris's end step, Carl activates Font of Vigor, flipping the forest he was looking for off the top. On his turn, he plays a forest, and then tapping that and 2 more lands, casts a Verdant Haven on his Selesnya Guildgate, gaining 2 life and drawing another card. Carl sacrifices his Tragic Poet, returning Marked by Honor to his hand, and then tapping for 4 mana, recast Marked by Honor on his commander, and then declares his commander as an attacker at Chris, who blocks it with his Aether Adept. Before damage, however, Carl taps mana to return Forced Worship to his hand. I untap, draw a card, and pass turn. In his upkeep, Sam's Center Soul rebounds, and having learned how protection works, targets his commander, giving it protection from white, which makes the aura fall off it. He casts some more face down, and then scavenges his Krosda Monitor from his graveyard, putting 3 1/1 counters on his commander. Tapping 2, he Megamorphs Misthoof Kirin, putting a 1/1 counter on it, which in turn puts another 1/1 counter on his commander. He swings his commander at Carl, who has no flying blockers. However, before damage, Carl taps a green and a white to cast a Lull, preventing all combat damage this turn. In his turn, Chris pays 4 to activate Rona, exiling the top card of his library. However, because it's a land, he cannot blaze it, so it stays in exile. Tapping 4, he casts a Fairy Mechanist, looking at the top 4 cards and revealing an artifact, and he reveals Guardian Automaton. He then swings at Carl, dealing another 5 damage. Carl plays another forest, and then tapping 6 mana, plays Big Daddy Colossal Dreadmaw, yeah boy! Tapping a further 3, recasts Force Worship on Sam's commander, drawing another card. And then another 3 to cast Ghostly Possession on Aven Surveyor, drawing another card. I play a Plains and pass. Sam swings his Kirin at Carl for 3 damage. Paying 1, Chris basic land cycles Ash Baron, searching for a swamp and playing it. And tapping 4, activates Rona, exiling another land. Tapping a further 4 mana, casts Guardian's Automaton, and then swings at Carl for a further 2 damage. Carl plays a Plains for turn, and then tapping the Selesnya Guildgate and 2 more lands, bestows Leaf Crown Dryad on his Colossal Dreadmaw, drawing a card. He furthermore taps 6 more mana to cast a Humbler of Mortals, which gives all his creatures trample as it enters the battlefield. He swings his commander at Sam, who blocks it with Whisperer of the Wilds, taking 4 commander damage. However, before damage, I decide to cast Tendrils of Corruption on it, meaning he takes the full damage. In his second main, Carl cycles Secluded Steppe, drawing a card. I play a Plains and then take the time to neatly rearrange my lands and pass turn. Sam plays a Plains and taps 2 to cast an Arcbound Stinger, which enters with a 1/1 counter, which puts a 1/1 counter on his commander, and then swings at me for 3 damage in the air. Chris activates Rona, exiling the top card, which happens to be a Scalding Cauldron, which he then casts. Following that, he casts a Mirror Enforcer and pass turn. Carl plays a Forest for turn, and taps 3 mana to cast an Auramancer. When it enters the battlefield, he gets Pious Interdiction back from his graveyard. He bounces Forced Worship to his hand, and taps 4 mana to cast Pierce Interdiction on Sam's commander instead, gaining 2 life and drawing a card. He follows that up with tapping 2 mana to cast a Fertile Ground on his forest, drawing another card. He declares his commander as attacking against Sam, who double blocks it with his Lieutenant and his Hybrid. The Hybrid dies and he moves all the 1/1 counters over to his other artifact creature, which then puts a 1/1 counter on his commander. I cast a Macabre Waltz, getting back a Soul Warden and Chittering Rats to my hand and discarding a Supernatural Stamina. I obviously then tap a white for Soul Warden, and then cast Chittering Rats. When it enters the battlefield, I target Chris, and I gain a life off Soul Warden. In his turn, Sam casts God's Willing on his commander, trying to get rid of the Pierce Interdiction. However, in response, Carl taps 3 to cast Afterlife, destroying his commander. Sam gets a bird and commiserates his loss. Sam then taps 8 mana and recasts Enduring Scalelord. I gain life off it entering, and then retrospectively off the bird entering as well. In Sam's end step, Chris convokes all his creatures to cast Unmake the Graves, getting back Aether Adept and Dreamstalker. He also activates Scalding Cauldron to get rid of Carl's Harvest Guard Elated. In his turn, Chris activates Rona, exiling Prophet of the Peak, and then taps for 6 mana to cast it. Carl recasts Forced Worship on Chris's Noble, drawing a card. He also plays Nature's Claim, blowing up Sam's Stinger and giving him 4 life. Following this, he taps 3 to cast a Generous Stray, I gain a life and he draws a card on ETB. He plays his land for turn, and tapping 5 mana returns Vineweft from his graveyard to hand, and then tapping an additional green, casts Vineweft on his commander, drawing a card. I tap 2 to cast a Dust Legion Zealot, and then slam down a land angrily. Sam taps 5 mana to cast a Palace Sentinel. When it enters, he becomes the Monarch. He swings his commander and his Kirin at me, which I suddenly realise kills me from commander damage. I flip the top card of my library and get very upset that it's a removal spell. Chris once more activates Rona, exiling Graven Abomination off the top of his library, which he then plays. He taps 2 mana to cast a Dreamstalker, bouncing Mystic Sanctuary back to his hand, which he then plays as his land for turn to put Whiplash Trap on his library. Carl once again bounces Forced Worship back to his hand and recasts it on the same creature to draw a card. Taps 2 mana to cast a Sakashima Tribe Elder, and then a further 3 mana to cast a Kodama's Reach, getting a Plains to hand and a Plains to the battlefield tapped. He then plays the Plains for turn. On his turn, Sam casts an Arcbound Worker, which enters with a 1/1 counter, putting another counter on his commander. He also casts an Impressive Raise on Carl's Colossal Dreadmaw, and then draws a card for Monarchy. Chris activates Rona, exiling a Hexplate Golem, and then taps the 7 mana required to cast it. Carl taps 5 mana to cast Knightly Valor on his Colossal Dreadmaw, getting a 2/2 Knight and drawing a card. He then taps 2 mana to cast a Disenchant, targeting Chris's Hexplate Golem. He taps a further 2 mana to cast Rabid Bite, targeting his Colossal Dreadmaw, killing Chris's Prophet of the Peak. In his turn, Sam taps 3 mana to cast a Glint Sleeve Artisan, which enters with a 1/1 counter, putting another 1/1 counter on his commander. He taps 2 more mana to cast a Regeneration onto his commander. He swings at Carl with his commander and the Kirin. Carl plays 3 to block with his Colossal Dreadmaw and then takes 3 damage. And Sam regenerates his commander and then draws a card as the Monarch. Chris once again activates Rona, exiling Fleetfeather Sandals, taps a blue to cast an Artificer's Assistant, and taps a further 2 to cast a Fleetfeather Sandals. He taps 5 mana casting Whiplash Trap, bouncing Carl's commander and his Colossal Dreadmaw to hand. In response, Carl bounces Conviction and then lets it resolve. Using his last 2 mana, Chris equips his Fleetfeather Sandals to his Abomination and swings at Carl. But before damage, Carl taps 3 mana and casts a Kill Shot, killing him. In his end step, Carl sacrifices his Sakura Tribe Elder, getting a Forest to field. Carl recasts his commander, Colossal Dreadmaw, Conviction, drawing a card, and then Regeneration, drawing another card. He then swings at Chris with Oromancer, Leafcrown Dryad, Humbler of Mortals, Generous Stray, and a Night Token. I remind him it has Vigilance. Chris blocks the Cat with his Noble, the Dryad with his Dreamstalker, the Oromancer with his Guardian, and the Knight with his Enforcer. This kills the Cat, the Oromancer, and the Knight. Carl rounds up the turn by tapping 3 mana and casting a Midnight Guard. Sam taps 4 mana to cast an Inspiring Roar, putting a 1/1 counter on each of his creatures, which puts a further 6 on his commander. He taps 2 mana to cast Gliss's Scorn, targeting the Mere Enforcer, and takes Carl out of the game with his 2 flyers. As a side effect, this does remove Carl's limiting enchantments on Chris's creatures. Chris taps 3 to cast Aether Adept, bouncing Sam's commander to his hand and putting Regeneration to the graveyard, and a further 3 mana to cast Obnixilus's Cruelty, exiling his Kirin. He pays 2 to equip the Fleetfeather Sandals to give his Noble flying, and then swings in for the kill.
Bad angling. Oh, yeah, there we go. That's the one. Okay, can we stop now?
No. There you go.
What a game, ladies and gentlemen. My Cruel Celebrant obviously got incredibly mana screwed, and it didn't draw anything relevant for most of the game. Pinging everyone's life did speed the game up slightly, but it certainly didn't favour me. Carl, Sam and Chris were all fairly on par for most of the game. Carl drew an incredible amount of cards from his commander and did a great job keeping Enduring Scalelord under control with prevent attack effects. Sam's 1/1 counter synergy was incredibly powerful and needed constant control from Carl and Chris, otherwise he would have run away with the game and stomped everyone with commander damage. However, Chris's abuse of Rona's enter the battlefield trigger and bounce effects absolutely won him the game. The massive amount of synergy and repeatable effects he had gave him just the edge needed to eke out the win in a very tense balancing act of a game. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this special 4-player game. I probably won't be doing many more 4-ways as it makes for a slow game and it's not my preferred way to play the format. Again, this game was recorded over a year ago now, hence why the cards are not the most updated and we are missing a couple of the deck lists. However, you can find Satyr, Enchanter and Cruel Celebrant in the description, and I will find some example deck lists for Scalelord and Rona. I have some more games coming up soon, so stick around for those, and an exciting update in the next video. Keep playing Pauper Commander, and see you soon.